Well, it's Friday, July 19th, about 6:40 p.m. Eastern Time, and I think today I'm going to go ahead and try to start this 4.6 engine for the first time since April 9th, about 5:10 p.m. when I parked the wrecked car here where it currently sits. So this is going to be a very, very cold start, old cold start. And to start off with, I've got all the fluids with an initial fill. I've got an initial fill of coolant. Of course, there's air all in the system because the radiator was completely drained, the engine block was completely drained along with the heater core when I changed out the air conditioning and heating system. But the only way to let this thing get a big old burp is to start the engine, let it warm up to operating temperature and the thermostat open, and we start getting full circulation. So that's about as far as I can take it. There's enough coolant in here to prevent the engine from overheating, and I'm going to keep an eye on the gauge very closely. I've also got an initial fill of transmission fluid. There's the dipstick there. Takes 13.6 quarts. I've got about 12 quarts in it now. I don't want to overfill the transmission because it's a lot of trouble to drain it out. There's not really a drain plug on the pan. So better safe than sorry. 12 quarts would be plenty of fluid to prevent any damage upon initial startup. And last but not least, I've got the power steering all filled. You can't really see the level too well because the reservoir is kind of opaque. But I went ahead and filled it up, had the car up in the air and turn the wheels back and forth several times to purge any air out of the system. So I'm pretty sure I have enough fluid in here to prevent a dry startup. The power steering in this car takes about 2.2 pints, I believe. And the engine oil is the same as it was back in April. It's actually the same oil that was in there when I did the oil change video on this car. Or actually on that car. No need really to change the oil, no need to drain it, just by pulling out the engine. Over here are the two fuel lines. This is the fuel supply and this is the return coming from the pressure regulator. And these just snap on. And one of the things that I did is, I'll show you on the wrecked car over here. Before I assembled everything, I went ahead and took some Q-tips and went all up inside the connectors there and cleaned them out. There was a little bit of rust in there from just sitting, and because of the ethanol in the gas. You can see how these quick connect clamps work. You have this garter spring in there which goes around the entire circumference, and you got a couple of O-rings, and the O-rings are what does the sealing. These are made of silicone, so they're going to pretty much last forever. And the lines themselves are stainless steel. So went ahead and hooked them up, and as you can see, the car has a March 2012 state inspection sticker, and the way it was told to me is that the guy was on deployment and the car was sitting for a long time, maybe a year or more, and when he came back he noticed the inspection sticker was past due, and he went to take it to get it inspected, and at that very point in time, that's when that engine over there shut down and locked up on him. So the gasoline in this car is, I would say, at least a year old, if not more. Should still be in good enough shape to make the engine run and idle. Doesn't take a whole lot of energy to just make an engine idle, but it's certainly not going to win any races on that old gas. And what I want to do right now is build up pressure in the fuel system so I've got pressure to all the injectors before I try to crank the engine over, and I also want to check for leaks. So what I've done is I've pulled the fuel pump relay. It's just a standard Ford relay, or Bosch relay actually. There's the schematic. These two terminals are your coil. This is your feed. This is the switched part of the circuit, 87A and 87. So we're going to go ahead and tap into that with a jumper wire at the right terminal. I've got a small booster battery hooked up just to run the fuel pump. So I've got that going to the system ground there. And we're going to go ahead and connect it here far away from the fuel lines, because if there's any sparks, then there will be, because I'm going directly to the fuel pump itself and not the relay. So this is going to be handling all the current of the fuel pump, which is pretty much only about 3 to 5 amps, but it's enough to make a spark. And the reason I'm doing this is because the engine's nice and cold. I want to be able to, if I do have any fuel leaks here, it'll be less of a dangerous situation with a cold engine. And plus, without the engine running, I'm not going to have any noise, and I can hear the fuel running around and listen to the fuel pump and see what kind of shape it's in. So this is part of the startup procedures I'm going to do, and the attempt to start this engine for the very first time. I'm pretty excited about it. I've tightened the clutch fan onto the pulley as much as I can. I've also checked the fan belt or serpentine belt to make sure it's aligned on the pulleys and it's not going to walk off when I crank the engine over. And I've also spun the engine over by hand with the breaker bar on the crankshaft vibration damper down there, just to kind of feel with my hand if I've gotten the torque converter bolts tightened down right. See if, just to kind of feel for any kind of interference or anything before I have the full power of the engine turning over and possibly doing some damage. And of course I have all the fluids filled as much as I can. Once this thing gets running and warms up after a while, all I really need to do is just top off the fluids, and I'll be good to go from a mechanical standpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and energize the fuel pump. Thank you guys. Hopefully you guys can hear that. Slight little hissing sound. While that's running, I'm going to kind of put my finger in the joint between that garter spring, basically between the male and female connectors. And I'm just going to check for any kind of wetness. It looks like we're totally dry. Having a fuel leak, especially on a project like this, would be a great way to ruin your day. And because I've had basically the entire car taken apart, everything taken apart, I've got to check all the systems just to make sure that I didn't damage anything, didn't crack a line, nothing like that. It's very possible I could have hit one of these lines with this engine swinging back and forth on the hoist. And I just don't want to take any chances with gasoline. But so far I don't feel any leaks. We'll come back and listen to how that fuel pump sounds. I hope you guys can hear that. Sounds very good, nice and consistent. And one of the main things this is doing is it's building up pressure in the fuel system. It's circulating fuel all around the entire system, providing pressure to each one of the injectors. You don't have to do it like this. This is the easy way to do it. You could just get in the car and turn the key 500 times and, let it charge up that way, because when you turn the key to the run position, the fuel pump will run for a few seconds and then shut back down. I think this is a much more effective way to do it. So I think it's been running long enough now where I've got good pressure here. All you need for an engine to start is air, fuel, and ignition. So I think I've got the air and the fuel. If I've gotten the wiring harnesses all put in right, and my ignition module is not burned up, I'll also have ignition. So there's no reason why this thing shouldn't just light right off now on the first or second crank, especially since I have pressure built up now. I'm going to go ahead and turn off that fuel pump. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go ahead and put the battery in it. This battery here doesn't have enough energy to crank the engine over all by itself. It's really just a helper battery for emergencies. I'm going to go ahead and put the regular battery in down there. I could start it up just like this, but I want to go ahead and just set the intake manifold or intake plenum and air filter assembly in here, so I can hook up the air temperature sensor and the mass airflow sensor, just so I can avoid having any codes upon initial startup. So let me go ahead and get all that stuff assembled, and we will attempt to start this guy for the first time since April. Okay, the battery is in. It's the same battery that was in the wrecked car. And I have the air cleaner and air filter, the air cleaner assembly and intake snorkel just sitting in here kind of loose like this. The main purpose of this is just to see if the engine starts. This car is far from finished. I don't even have the wipers, windshield wipers installed yet. The main purpose of this is basically just to get an assessment of where things are at with this car, mechanical wise, before I go any further with the body work and lining all the panels and just tying up all the loose ends with this thing. If there is a major problem with this, I don't want to have adjusted all the body panels perfectly and then have to take something back off again. So that's the main reason for doing this, is just to give this thing a test and prove everything out. Let this engine run a little bit, hopefully. So here we go, finally. This is going to be the first startup since April 9th for this engine. Listening for any kind of rod knock or piston slap or timing chain rattle or anything like that. Any kind of bearing noise. I call this a success, starting up on the very first time. I had a little bit of rod knock I heard from inside the car when this thing first started up, because those bearings were a little bit too dry from just sitting there, and plus the engine was at weird angles on that engine hoist. So that basically just washed all the oil away from those bearings. Couldn't really do anything about that. But that noise went away almost instantaneously, which is what it's supposed to do. No fuel leaks. I basically have to check every single system on this car just to make sure there's no leaks, because I had every single system taken out. There's the power steering, high pressure, and return hoses. They look like they're doing fine. For those that don't know, I basically had that car torn down as far as this one is now. I changed power steering gears, changed engines and transmissions, of course. Changed the entire HVAC system, which is sitting right here. Changed the wiring harness on the dashboard, so I had the IP out. So I have to check every single part of the car that I touched just to make sure that there's not going to be any issues, especially leaks. These are the transmission cooler lines. Nice and dry. And they're getting kind of warm, which is good. And we'll check under the car to make sure there's no leaks under there. Especially right here where the catalytic converter meets the rest of the exhaust system. I had to take that apart. So I've got new gaskets in there now. You can tell the new pipe compared to the original old pipe. How shiny the new pipe is compared to the old one. I don't hear any exhaust coming out. And I don't see any leaks on the driveway. I'm not going to rev it up too much because it's cold. I mentioned before that I swapped the entire air conditioning system, including the compressor, receiver dryer, evaporator assembly, blower, everything. Because I wanted to have the automatic climate control instead of this thing, which is just like the one on my F-250. And that was a lot of major work. That required changing out the wiring harness from the instrument panel, as well as the wiring harness for the front of the car, so I could get this temperature sensor, the outside temperature sensor. So the next thing to figure out is, does all that stuff work? While I got the engine running. I stuck the original 13,000 mile instrument cluster in here because I just needed to have something to check the systems out with. And it looks like the ABS light never went off after startup, so I think I've got an ABS problem. But no check engine light, no airbag light. ABS problems I can handle because I have a whole nother car, the wrecked car in front of me, that I can rob parts off of. So this was the original climate control head. You can see all the heavy wiring that it needed to have because of the manual nature of it. And now I have the automatic climate control system in here, which also included having to install the ambient temperature sensor, which is really just a thermistor right in here. And you've got a draft tube right here that goes to the evaporator box in the engine compartment, just to get a little bit of negative pressure in there to make some air go across that thermistor there to measure the temperature. Let's see if we can see how hot it is outside. That's encouraging. I don't see any trouble codes lighting up on this thing. So let's make our set point. I guess I can't adjust it now. Let's go ahead and turn it on to automatic and see if the clutch engages. And the engine just pulled down. I got the IP all torn apart still. I'm not finished putting things back together, so it's kind of weird, but I do feel somewhat cool air coming out of here. Boy, that's nice. I like this so much better than that. It just took a lot of extra work, but I'm glad I did it. Let's check out things in the engine compartment. Oh, I got half a tank of bad gas in here. That's not as bad as a full tank of bad gas. Looks like voltage is hanging in at 14. Engine temperature is coming up. Just have to figure out why that's illuminated. I think that the system might be a little low on charge on a hot day like today. That AC compressor should be running constantly until the cabin temperature gets down to the set point before it starts to cycle. That's not terribly cold, and I don't see any moisture on the outside of it, so it's not running as efficiently as it could. The system's a little bit low on charge. Again, not a big deal, just need to drop a few cans of Freon in there. The compressor is operating, and it's operating quietly. And it is providing cool air. This car has an auxiliary cooling fan under here. These are the feed wires to it. And you might be able to hear it running now. Pulling nice air through that radiator, really strong. That fan is always going to run when the AC is turned on, or if the engine is in an overheat condition, it'll turn on to supplement that clutch fan. I'm going to give the engine some rev and see if that compressor will stay on any longer. No, it's just low on Freon. Next thing I'm going to try to do is test the transmission and see if it'll even go in gear. I'm not going to drive it anywhere, but I just want to see if it'll go in gear. And this is providing some cool air. It's not as cool as it should be. This pointer is not hooked up. I just have the instrument cluster just laying in here just for testing. This is the cable down here for it. And you got to hook the cable up, and once you do, you'll get a reading. So I'm going to go ahead and drop it down in gear, put it in reverse. And car will move. Go to neutral. Now we'll go to drive. The car does want to move forward. We'll shift down into 2 and then into 1. And what this is doing is, since I just filled the transmission, I'm circulating that fluid through all the different sections of the valve body, just to work out any of the air bubbles. We'll test the OD off function. That seems to work. And we'll go to gear one more time. Here's neutral. There's drive. And even though it's 87 degrees outside, I need to go ahead and do a full test. We'll go to floor and turn the heat on. Make sure that blend air door is functioning like it should. And make sure the heater core is working like it should also. And that's pretty uncomfortable, it's pretty hot. And it's coming down in the right location. I like my AC about 72 degrees. And we'll go to vent. And we're now getting air back up at the IP level versus the floor where the transmission hump is. So this car is a long way from finished. It's still a mess. Got to fix the ABS system for some reason. The car will still stop. I'm just not going to have ABS or traction control. I'm not too concerned about that. I have a whole nother car here I can take parts off of to fix that. I am very excited. This is just definitely a reason to celebrate right now, to finally get this car to the point where it's actually able to move under its own power. The engine's running. Didn't have any major problems with the transmission or torque converter mating up to the back of the engine. That's all squared away. No vibrations, no unusual vibrations, no unusual noises. No check engine light. Very, very good. And we're starting to get some pressure in this hose, so I know that the thermostat's opened up all the way. And we've dropped down in our level a little bit, which is to be expected. I just took a real big burp. Once this thing is shut down and cools off, it's going to thermal cycle. I'll go ahead and top off that overflow bottle and the coolant system will be done. No leaks around the heater core hoses. This thing is solid. I just need to tie up loose ends, like make sure that my wiring is all tucked away nice and neat, such as this being put into the hole right here and tucked away. Make sure all the cables are routed properly. Put the battery strap back on. Align all the body panels. Put the front end back on, of course. Air the tires up. Put the wipers on. And get this thing inspected. Once this thing passes inspection, that's going to be a badge of honor, considering how much, what state this thing was torn down at. That engine sounds nice and smooth and quiet. Now that the thermostat's opened up, I can probably give this thing a few revs. Very responsive, even with the old gas in here. This Crown Victoria absolutely will be on the road again very soon, provided that a meteor doesn't fall down and crush it. Other than that, I think I'm in a really good position to undo a past mistake here. So this was just a little bit of a peek into the startup sequence of this thing and check out of the various systems. I still need to put the IP back together, check all the exterior lighting, of course, double check the wiring, take a look at the ABS system. More than likely, maybe I forgot to hook up one of the ABS wheel sensors. Maybe something got pinched, who knows. But I think I'm in a very good state right now to go ahead and invest more time in this thing and get this car just right.